In 1978, an ethnographer named Vera Schultz recorded the final testimony of an elder from an uncontacted community in the upper Xingu basin. The elder described, in a language no outsider had previously documented, a civilization that came before his own people. He called them the ones who went below. He said they left instructions. He said some of those instructions were still being followed. What Schultz recorded that day has almost never been discussed. What's in her field notes is worth hearing carefully. I want to begin with the recording itself, not with the history around it, not with the broader context. With the specific moment in 1978 when Vera Schultz extended a microphone toward an old man sitting on a low wooden platform in the upper Xingu basin and pressed record. Schultz was a German ethnographer. She had been working in the region since 1974, documenting communities in various stages of contact with the outside world. By 1978, she had 4 years of fieldwork behind her. She was not a romantic. She was a careful professional, trained to transcribe what she heard without editorializing, to record what was said without imposing interpretive frameworks on material she didn't yet understand. The elder she recorded in 1978 was referred to in her notes as the last speaker. Not his name, a designation. He was believed to be the final fluent carrier of his community's oldest oral tradition. The linguistic family his speech belonged to was so isolated that Schultz had spent months simply developing enough phonetic transcription to follow the basic structure of what he was saying. A full translation took considerably longer. What the elder described in that recording was not what Schultz had expected to find. He described his people as not the first in their territory. He was specific about this. He distinguished between the history of his own community, traceable, nameable, located in time his elders had described to their elders, and a prior presence that existed before any of that lineage began. He called this prior presence, in her eventual translation, the ones who went below. He described a period of catastrophe. Fire from above, water from below, his phrasing physical and specific, not metaphorical in the way creation stories tend to be metaphorical. He described the predecessor civilization, surviving that catastrophe not by dying, but by going underground. Beneath the forest, beneath the earth, below the water in certain places, and before they went, he said, they left instructions, not stories, not myths, instructions, specific practices, specific words, specific ritual forms that his people had been asked to maintain. He used a word Schultz translated carefully and repeatedly, always with a qualifier, as something close to holding. His people were holding these things on behalf of something that had not yet returned for them. This is where Schultz flagged the recording as requiring special handling. Her annotation in the margin of her field notebook reads, "This is not cosmological tradition." He distinguishes between what they believe and what they were given. He is clear these are different categories. A man who is the last carrier of his community's oldest tradition is describing a custodial responsibility, a job, not a belief, specific things to maintain, specific forms to preserve, on behalf of something that went underground and has not come back. Her complete field archive is held at the Frobenius Institute in Frankfurt. It is partially catalogued. Portions of it are restricted under community protection agreements, which in practice means that certain recordings, including, I found when I traced the finding aid, the 1978 session specifically, are not available for general research access. Why an ethnographic recording from 1978 of a tradition about a predecessor civilization requires active protection in 2024 is a question the archive's finding aid does not answer. Schultz was not the first person to encounter this category of testimony in the Amazon. The men who preceded her by 2.5 centuries documented something strikingly similar, and what happened to their documentation establishes the template for everything that has come after. Father João Daniel arrived in the Amazon in 1741. He spent 18 years in the deep interior, longer than almost any other Jesuit missionary of his era. before the 1759 expulsion ended his work there permanently. He was arrested in Lisbon, not simply expelled. While imprisoned, he continued writing. He attempted repeatedly to have his manuscript published. He died in captivity in 1776, still waiting. His manuscript was eventually published in the 19th century, posthumously, in heavily edited form. I want to be specific about what edited means in this context. The published version of Daniel's work is a substantial document. It covers language, geography, natural history, a community practice, across dozens of Amazon peoples. It is cited in the ethnographic literature. It is considered a foundational document of early Amazon documentation. The editing removed specific sections. Researchers who have examined the correspondence surrounding the publication process, the letters between editors, the institutional discussions about what to include. Consistently note that the sections excised were specifically those dealing with what Daniel described as pre-contact indigenous practice, what the communities were doing before the missionaries arrived. What they already knew, Daniel was trained as a linguist as well as a theologian. He was a rigorous observer by the standards of his era, and what he wrote about certain Amazon communities, the observation that has stayed with me since I first encountered it in a secondary source footnote, and then traced to the primary, was this, that he found among them a form of the sacred meal, his phrase, that was corrupted by time but recognizable in its bones, corrupted by time, not coincidentally similar, not independently invented in parallel, corrupted by time, which implies an original that degraded through transmission without reinforcement. A form that existed in some earlier, cleaner version, and had travelled through generations of practice without the context that would have allowed it to be maintained precisely. Daniel had every institutional reason to describe the Amazon peoples he encountered as entirely ignorant of Christian practice. That ignorance was the theological and political justification for the entire missionary enterprise. If they already had the forms, the mission was redundant. If they already knew the words, the conversion was, what exactly? He wrote it anyway, and then he died in prison while trying to publish it. The sections of his manuscript that might clarify exactly what he observed, what specific words, what specific ritual forms, what specific practices he found recognizable, are not in the published version. What they contained I cannot tell you with certainty. The unedited original is not publicly accessible. That pattern, an observer documents something anomalous. The documentation is edited before publication. The original is made inaccessible, is not unique to Daniel. It is the first Isolde. It is the first clear instance of a mechanism that appears to operate consistently across 3 centuries of Amazon documentation. The next layer of evidence for what Daniel was observing is linguistic, and it is the most precise form the anomaly takes. Here is a fact about language that linguists state without controversy. Language families that developed in isolation from each other share no vocabulary. The word for water in Basque has no relationship to the word for water in Swahili. The word for fire in Japanese has no relationship to the word for fire in Quechua. This is not a tendency or a statistical pattern. It is the structural foundation of comparative linguistics. Shared vocabulary between unrelated languages, languages with no documented contact corridor, approaches 0. The Amazon contains approximately 300 identified language families. That number is itself anomalous. For comparison, Europe, with a far longer recorded history of migration, conquest, and contact, has a handful. The linguistic fragmentation of the Amazon basin is one of the genuinely unresolved puzzles of human prehistory. 300 families, 300 independent evolutionary lines. The reasons for that fragmentation are still debated, but within that fragmentation, researchers working in Amazonian linguistics have documented something that the standard framework cannot comfortably absorb. A certain core ritual vocabulary appears across language families that are otherwise entirely unrelated, not borrowed words, The phonological shape of borrowed words typically reveals the direction and period of borrowing. Not trade words. Trade vocabulary has its own identifiable patterns of diffusion. These are shared words, with no documentable pathway between the languages that carry them. Shared as if from a common source that preceded all of them. Some of this shared vocabulary shows phonetic resemblance to archaic Latin roots. Not classical Latin, older forms, Proto-Italic roots that predated the Roman Empire, that existed before any European presence in the Western Hemisphere had any historical basis for existing. In 1723, a Jesuit father working in the upper Rio Negro basin wrote a mission report. One sentence in that report sits in a digitized archive at a level of bureaucratic depth that apparently discouraged most readers for 3 centuries. He wrote, "The people already knew the words. We did not teach them. We found them." That sentence was written by a man trained as a linguist, a rigorous observer, a man who understood the significance of what he was recording. There is no excitement in it, no wonder. Just the flat, exhausted notation of someone confronting something that should not exist and finding no adequate category for it. The 1723 report is not an isolated case. Multiple Jesuit fathers, working in different parts of the Amazon basin, across a 60-year span, documented the same observation independently. Different men, different territories, different language communities, different decades. No opportunity to compare notes. Weeks of jungle travel separated their territories. They all found words that were already there. The official explanation is contamination. Earlier undocumented contact, observer bias, misattribution. These explanations are possible. They are worth taking seriously, but they require assuming that the same misattribution happened to multiple independent observers across 6 decades in different locations with different linguistic communities, and that none of those observers noticed the inconsistency between what they were finding and what those explanations would require. I held the contamination explanation for a while. Then I found the drawings in 2017. A peer-reviewed paper in a mainstream archaeology journal published the results of LiDAR surveys conducted over sections of the Bolivian Amazon. LiDAR strips away the visual noise of the canopy and reveals what's on the ground beneath it. What the 2017 survey revealed was geometric earthwork structures of extraordinary scale, organized, planned, built to a level of precision that the authors noted bore resemblance to urban planning principles seen in the Indus Valley and pre-dynastic Egypt. The paper was careful. It made no dramatic claims. It described what the LiDAR showed and offered, measured interpretations of what that might mean for the pre-contact history of the region. But buried in the supplementary materials, not the main paper, the supplementary materials, was a notation that I found myself returning to repeatedly. The underground channel systems detected by the LiDAR appeared to extend beyond the surveyed area. The direction of that extension, the paper noted, was consistent with local indigenous oral traditions describing underground passage networks. The archaeologists noted this correspondence. They wrote it down in the supplementary materials where fewer people look, and then they did not design a follow-up study to investigate it. I want to be precise about what that means methodologically. A peer-reviewed scientific paper noted a correspondence between physical evidence, underground channels extending in a specific direction, and an oral tradition describing underground passages in that same direction. And then the scientific process that produced that paper did not generate a subsequent investigation of the correspondence. That is not suppression. Suppression would leave traces of its own. What this looks like is something more ordinary and in some ways more effective. A finding that sits in the supplementary materials of a 2017 paper, accurately recorded, never followed. The oral traditions referenced in those supplementary materials are the same category of tradition Schultz, documented in 1978. Underground passage networks, predecessor civilizations that went below. communities maintaining specific inherited knowledge about what has down there, the physical evidence and the oral tradition correspond. The scientific paper noted the correspondence. No one pursued it. The institutional pattern that begins with Father Daniel in 1757 does not end with a sealed archive. It continues in what peer-reviewed science notes, and then quietly does not follow. What happened to the Jesuit records after 1759 is where the institutional pattern becomes impossible to explain away. On September 3rd, 1759, the Marquis of Pombal issued the order expelling the Society of Jesus from all Portuguese territories. Brazil was Portuguese territory. The Amazon missions were Brazilian territory. The Jesuits were gone within months. The expulsion was politically motivated. The Jesuits had accumulated significant power and influence in South America, and the Portuguese colonial government felt they had become too independent. The secular colonial authorities moved quickly to seize Jesuit property and records. This is documented history, not contested. What is less examined is the specific handling of the Amazon mission records. In the fragmentary administrative orders that survive in the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino in Lisbon, documents recording how the expulsion was implemented in practical terms. There are specific instructions regarding the deep interior Amazon missions, not the coastal missions, not the reduction communities, not the well-documented territories closer to colonial administration. The deep interior records specifically, those records, the journals, maps, and correspondence from first contact missions with communities no European had previously reached, were directed to be transmitted not to Lisbon, not to the Portuguese colonial administration that had ordered the expulsion and was actively hostile to the Society of Jesus, but directly to Rome, to the Vatican. Think about what that means institutionally. A secular colonial government in the middle of suppressing a religious order transmitted that order's most sensitive records to the religious institution that oversaw it. Portugal and the Society of Jesus were, in 1759, adversaries. The expulsion was a political act against an organization that had become too powerful. And yet these specific records went to Rome. Why? The Vatican Apostolic Archive contains a classified section relating to the Amazon Jesuit missions. I confirmed its existence through references in published Vatican finding aids. It is listed, it is noted, it is designated, it is sealed. Not lost, not damaged, not transferred to a different institution. Sealed in 2024. Records from the 17th and 18th century, still sealed. The conventional explanation for sealing historical archives of this age is community protection. Avoiding harm to indigenous peoples whose practices or locations might be documented in the records. That is a legitimate concern, and it applies to some archival restrictions on Amazon-related materials. But community protection designations are typically applied transparently, with publicly stated rationale. What the Vatican's Amazon section carries is a simple restricted access designation, with no stated rationale in any finding aid I have been able to locate. Father Daniel died in Lisbon in 1776, still trying to publish his unedited account. His manuscript's edited version appeared in the 19th century, with the pre-contact sections removed. The mission records went to Rome. The Vatican's Amazon section remained sealed. 3 centuries, and the same category of information. What Amazon communities knew before Europeans arrived, what they were already practicing, what words they already had, remains in the same condition. Documented, noted, inaccessible. The communities who carry the living version of that information are running out of time. Every major linguistic group in the Amazon that has been studied in any depth possesses, at the center of its cosmological tradition, a story about origin, not creation mythology in the abstract sense, though those exist separately, but something more specific, the origin of the community's particular knowledge, the source of its ritual practice, the reason it maintains specific forms with a precision that goes beyond ordinary cultural transmission. and across language families with no documented relationship to each other, that origin account shares a structure so consistent that calling it coincidence requires a level of commitment to the conventional framework that the evidence increasingly resists. A civilization, immensely knowledgeable, a catastrophe, fire from above, water from below, the specific pairing appearing across communities that share no linguistic ancestry, the civilization going underground rather than dying, and before it went, the leaving of keepers. People, communities, lineages, specific family lines, charged with maintaining specific practices, specific words, specific ritual forms, until the civilization returned, or until someone came looking. The Hopi tradition calls them the Ant People. The Cherokee oral record, documented by James Mooney in the 1870s, describes the people before the people, what the elder Schultz, recorded in 1978, called the ones who went below. What Father Daniel encountered in the 1750s and described as a form corrupted by time but recognizable in its bones. Different languages, different continents, different centuries of documentation. The same structure. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming. The same cosmological structure appearing across unrelated cultures is not, by itself, evidence of a common origin. Human beings share certain universal tendencies. Underground survival as a response to surface catastrophe is a logical narrative. Hidden knowledge, as a metaphor for cultural resilience, is a recurring human story. Comparative mythologists have frameworks for this, and those frameworks are worth respecting. The communities themselves draw a distinction that those frameworks tend to flatten. They distinguish between what they believe and what they were given, between their mythology and their custodial responsibility. The elder Schultz, recorded in 1978, was specific about this. Schultz's annotation noted it, that he was making a clear distinction between the two categories. He was not describing a belief. He was describing a job, and the job, across all of these traditions, is the same. Hold specific things, maintain specific forms, preserve specific words, on behalf of something that went underground and has not yet returned. What that something is, what the specific things are that are being maintained, is old. What the words mean that communities hold without fully understanding. The sealed archive might contain part of the answer. The restricted recordings at the Frobenius Institute might contain part of the answer. Father Daniel's unedited manuscript, wherever it is, might contain part of the answer. What none of these sources has yet been permitted to fully tell is what the communities themselves have always insisted they know, that they are not the beginning of this story, that someone came before them, and that the ones who came before them did not leave. Vera Schultz's archive is in Frankfurt. The Vatican section is sealed. The elders are still there. The questions are still open.